Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at another twisted case with you. Today's video is about the case of Ronald Gene Simmons. This man successfully killed 16 people in less than a month. When you hear of serial killings and mass murders, you almost always think of randomized killings, mass shootings, and maybe arson or a terrorist attack. But one story would have your insides in turmoil. Shortly before Christmas in 1987, Gene Simmons murdered 16 people within a 7-day period, with 14 of these being relatives. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved the victims, and all those affected by this case. Born in Chicago, Illinois on the 15th of July, 1940, Ronald Gene Simmons was welcomed into a somewhat troubled and dysfunctional family. Just less than 3 years after his birth, he would lose his dad, William Simmons, to a stroke. However, his mother didn't mourn for long as she remarried within a year. She would marry William D. Griffin, a civil engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Over the next few years, the family was transferred a couple of times across Arkansas. Little Ronald became troubled due to the frequent relocation, which made him act out at school by being a bully and causing trouble. He was a difficult student who unleashed his bitterness on his fellow students. He was considered to be too troublesome to stay in school at age 16. His parents tried everything to discipline him, but it didn't work, so they sent him to military school as the final option. Ronald enjoyed military life so much that after he left school on September 15, 1957, he enlisted in the United States Navy. He was first stationed at Naval Station Bremerton in Washington, where he met Bersabe Rebecca Becky Ulibarri. On July 9, 1960, he married Rebecca in New Mexico. After they got married, Ronald's domineering ways soon became obvious in their marriage. All because of his military experience, Ronald insisted on a clean and organized home, and even tried controlling Becky's choices for clothes and hairstyles. He damaged her self-worth and increased the way she relied on him by gradually cutting her off from friends and family. Criticism and verbal harassment turned into means of dominating her. Over the following 18 years, the couple would have 7 children. Their relationship remained rocky even after Ronald Gene Simmons Jr., their first child, was born. After Ronald was released from the Navy in 1963 and enlisted in the U.S. Air Force around 2 years later, his aggressive behavior continued and got worse. Becky was afraid of the outside world as a single mother, so she stayed obedient even with Ronald's terrible behavior. Their home operated like a military base, and no one was allowed to live freely. Ronald was unwilling to tolerate his kids' disobedience. He made the early decision that any child who disobeyed him would be punished. He always took it personally and would see it as a sign of disloyalty if a duty given to any child wasn't completed correctly. He imposed authority over everyone who lived under his roof. Ronald's favorite person was his daughter Sheila. He was with her most of his free time. The love he'd shown her was very noticeable. Only Sheila was given extra attention or privileges from him as a father. Ronald gathered the family into a room one day for a meeting. His goal was to make clear to them what his bond with Sheila was all about. Now 17 years old, she carried his child in her womb. He made the decision that she would carry the child to term and raise it alongside the family. He expected the rest of the family to accept his incestuous relationship with his daughter. Becky couldn't say anything because she had become so broken by Ronald's manipulation. However, Sheila's elder brother, Ronald Jr., who was sick of the entire thing, reported Sheila's pregnancy to her school counselor. At first, Sheila denied that she was pregnant when her school authorities started to probe into her case, but she wasn't able to convince them. She was pressed for information about who the father was, and after nearly a month, she broke down and confessed that her father got her pregnant. In the course of his 20-year military tenure, Ronald received the Air Force Ribbon for Excellent Marksmanship, the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross, and the Bronze Star Medal. but he withdrew from the Air Force from military duty on November 30th, 1979, with the rank of Master Sergeant. However, on the 3rd of April, 1981, the Department of Human Services in Cloudcroft, New Mexico, opened an investigation against Ronald after the reports started flying around that he had fathered a child with his 17-year-old daughter. Fearing arrest, Ronald and his family left New Mexico in late 1981 and moved to Ward, Arkansas in Lonoke County, and then in the summer of 1983 to Pope County, which is close to Dover, Arkansas. Moving to a 13-acre plot of property 6.5 miles north of Dover, the family named the area Mockingbird Hill. A year later, with the victim and the perpetrator no longer in the picture, the examination into Ronald Gene Simmons and the incestuous rape of his daughter stopped. The case was abandoned. States were ill-prepared to prosecute criminals who had relocated to other states at that time. The house they moved to was made up of two larger, older model mobile homes that were connected together. Neither house had indoor plumbing or a phone. There were dozens of no trespassing signs posted along the path that led them to the house. Perfect for a man who was eager to avoid attracting attention for having sex with his daughter. There was no plumbing in the house, so Ronald had his family dig 3 cesspits. Ronald had many menial jobs in the adjacent town of Russellville, Arkansas. It was extremely difficult for Ronald to find himself in a situation where he was being disregarded by coworkers, employers, and the general public after being honored for his work as a military officer and given awards for it. He felt they no longer regarded him as superior, even though he had risked his life for them. He was able to land a job in a legal company as a clerk. His employers acknowledged his discipline and strong work ethic. Everything was going right until he made some rude sexual advances to a female employee. After she informed management of this, he was fired right away. Ronald always believed he had a right to women's attention and sexual reciprocity, treating them like objects he could use. Once more, Ronald found employment, this time with Woodline Motor Freight Company. He decided to be purely platonic and professional in his dealings with female co-workers this time. He still held a little hatred for women, though, and didn't like civilian rule. All this made it even more disgusting to him that he had a female, Joyce Elaine Butts, as his boss. Ronald was really rude to Joyce and never followed any of her rules or instructions. All this hostile behavior towards his boss caused him to be fired again. It hadn't occurred to Ronald that getting fired had anything to do with his unprofessional conduct and insubordination. The way he saw it, the women of Arkansas were conspiring against him, and it was costing him his right to earn a living. He later on was able to get a job as a convenience store clerk. Much later, Sheila's boyfriend, Dennis, visited the family house with the intention to ask Ronald for Sheila's hand in marriage. Ronald was enraged by what he heard, especially when he was told that Dennis had already proposed to Sheila, and all he visited for was to make further plans for their wedding and his marriage to Sheila. Ronald told Dennis that he wasn't going to allow Sheila and Sheila's daughter, Sylvia, who was the offspring from Ronald and Sheila, to leave the house. Unknown to Ronald, Dennis already had a plan and had taken Sheila and Sylvia out of the house before Ronald got home. Ronald started drinking heavily after this event, and a few weeks later, he quit his job at the convenience store. Most of the children had moved out by this time, and there were even rumors that Becky was having an affair. Ronald couldn't take it anymore. He felt he had lost control of his family after he tried so hard to keep them in his grips. He was frustrated and knew he had to find a way to restore his dominance over his family and punish them for all the wrong they'd done. 4 days after quitting his job, on the 22nd of December, Ronald began his killings. It was around Christmas time. He knew most of his family would be visiting for the holidays, so he figured this was the perfect time to carry out the plan he had been brooding in his mind for so long. His first son, Ronald Gene Jr., who came visiting, was the first victim. While Gene was unaware, Ronald hit him in the center of his forehead with a crowbar. Ronald continued hitting him with a crowbar over and over. He didn't stop there. He pounded the boy's face with the crowbar one more time, breaking his nose. To make sure that Gene had no chance to survive, Ronald hit him with maximum impact on his skull. He then stomped on Gene's groin to make sure he was still unresponsive. Becky heard the sound coming from the beatings and tried to check for what was happening. Ronald heard her coming, so he hid. When she saw the sight of her son covered in blood before her, she went into shock. She was so upset she didn't see Ronald coming. Before she even noticed him, Ronald hit her with the crowbar across her shoulders, and she fell to the floor. He looked at her with so much revenge in his eyes. He felt Becky was the reason all his children rebelled. He looked at her as she crawled on the floor trying to get away from him. He hit her multiple times with the crowbar, breaking her ribs. He was determined to make it hurt as much as possible, so he struck her with the teeth of the crowbar and dislodged chunks of flesh from her body. Becky was dead by the time he finished beating her. To be sure she was dead, he shot her with a .22 caliber pistol in the back of her head. Barbara, Ronald, and Becky's youngest daughter, was startled awake by the gunshot and began to cry. She continued crying, and it became tiresome, so Ronald headed for her room with a gun concealed behind his back. He hid the pistol when he arrived at her bedside and wrapped his arms around her. As if to console her, his hands moved up her back to her neck, and then he wrapped them around her throat and squeezed until he choked the last gust of breath out of her. Ronald then took the corpses of all those he had killed to the cesspit and tossed their bodies there.
9 more bodies found this morning in Dover. The victims may be the wife, children, and grandchildren of the gunman. The toll now stands at 16 dead in an Arkansas murder case.
This is the same cesspit he asked the children to dig when they moved into the house. Barbara peed on herself from fear while Ronald choked her to death, so he put her body in a garbage bag and tossed her body beside her mother's. He then attached some barbed wire around the perimeter of the cesspit to prevent animals getting in. His final step was to douse the corpses of his wife and children with kerosene to prevent the strong odor of dead bodies. After these murders, Ronald waited patiently for the other children to get home from school. When their school bus finally dropped them off, he told them that he had presents for them but wanted to surprise them with them one at a time in their rooms.
Police believe those in the grave were killed first, possibly Wednesday or Thursday. Then the 5 in the house arrived from out of town. Police say they were probably killed immediately, and along with them, 2 grandchildren, each about 2 years old, found later today in the separate trunks of 2 cars at the house.
He first killed his daughter, 17-year-old Loretta. He took her into the living room through the doors that led outside. Loretta looked like Sheila and made him remember the way Sheila betrayed him. With that anger, he grabbed her hair and shoved her face into a water barrel filled with ice-cold water. She struggled but couldn't stop Ronald. When she eventually died and her body went still, he brought her remains to the cesspit and threw her in with the rest. The 3 other children, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky, were then killed in the same way and subsequently dumped in the cesspit. This was the first phase of the murders. Ronald would then have to wait for 4 more days to carry out the next round of killings. As it was the Christmas period, Ronald and his wife had invited the older Simmons children over to the house for celebrations on the 26th of December. This arrival was what Ronald Simmons was waiting for. The first to arrive were William H. Simmons II, 23, his wife, Renata Mae Simmons, 21, and their son, William H. Simmons III, who was 20 months old. According to reports, Ronald shot the 2 parents in the dining room, covered their bodies with coats and blankets, and left them by the dining table. He then strangled and drowned the baby and placed him into the trunk of a car behind the Simmons home. Next to arrive were Ronald's 24-year-old daughter, Sheila, and her husband, 33-year-old Dennis Raymond McNulty, who brought their children, 7-year-old Sylvia and 21-month-old Michael. When they walked in, they took a few paces before freezing at the sight of the corpses that were neatly arranged in a row horizontally. Just like he did before, Ronald shot both Sheila and Dennis. Ronald grabbed their 21-month-old son and choked him to death. Once he was dead, he took him outside and tossed him into a patch of mud. He strangled Sylvia to death as well and kept her body with the rest. Evidence showed that Ronald laid the bodies of his whole family in neat rows in the lounge. Their bodies were covered with coats except that of Sheila, who was covered by Rebecca Simmons' best tablecloth. He put Sheila and Dennis's son's body in the car's trunk and left it at a spot where broken-down cars were often abandoned. He felt the boy was unworthy to decompose in the company of the rest of his family, being that he was the son of Dennis. After the murders, Ronald drove to a Sears store in Russellville, where he picked up the Christmas gifts that he had previously ordered for his family. Later that night, he drove to a private club to drink and celebrate his successful plan before returning home, where he spent the rest of the evening and the following day drinking beer and watching television. Ronald's mission to avenge himself against all who had done wrong to him was not complete, however. The next day, on the morning of December 28, 1987, Ronald drove a car that had belonged to his son, Ronald Jr., to a Walmart in Russellville, where he purchased another gun to use in the attack he was about to carry out. His first target was the Peel, Eddy, and Gibbons law firm. Kathy Kendrick, who got him fired for sexual harassment, was still employed there, and he was about to take his revenge. He wore a cowboy hat as a disguise. Everybody in the office could hear the sound of Kathy screaming and then the gunshot. She died before the ambulance arrived. As of then, Ronald was not yet identified as the perpetrator. Next, he went to the Taylor Oil Company, where he shot and wounded Russell "Rusty" Taylor, the owner of the Sinclair Mini-Mart from which Ronald had recently resigned. He also shot and killed J.D. Jim Chaffin, a fireman and part-time truck driver for Taylor Oil. Chaffin was the only deceased victim who was a stranger to Ronald. Ronald shot at and missed another employee before exiting the building. Ronald then went to the Sinclair Mini-Mart, where he shot and wounded Roberta Woolery and David Salieri. His final target was the Woodline Motor Freight Company, where he located his former supervisor, Joyce Butts, and shot her in the head and chest, wounding her. He then took worker Vicki Jackson at gunpoint into the computer office and ordered her to call the police. "I've come to do what I wanted to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me," he told her.
But the killings didn't stop here at the secluded house. Two, Jim Chafin and Kathy Kendrick, were murdered publicly in Russellville on Monday morning, bringing the total number of bodies to 16.
When the police arrived, Ronald handed over his gun and surrendered without any resistance. Throughout the 40-minute-long rampage, Ronald had killed 2 and injured 4 others. After the police arrested Ronald, they went to his house to investigate further and to find his motive for the murders. That is where they found the bodies of his 14 other victims. Ronald was sent to the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock for a competency evaluation by staff psychiatrist Dr. Irving Kuo. Dr. Kuo would later deem him sane and able to stand trial. A family friend told investigators that Becky had been saving up money to divorce Ronald when the killings happened. The former freight company supervisor who survived the shooting also testified that Ronald had yelled at her during a previous argument about pay. Investigators would later find a letter inside a safe deposit box between Ronald and his daughter Sheila. Ronald was angry that Sheila had revealed he was the father of her child, and he wrote he would see her in hell. When the prosecutor presented it in court, Ronald punched him in the face and tried to get a deputy's handgun before being removed from the courtroom. Conviction and sentencing. After the psychiatric evaluation, Ronald first went on trial for the murders of Kendrick and Chaffin and was found guilty on May 12, 1988, being sentenced to death. The jury selection for the first trial took less than 6 hours. On May 16th, Judge John Samuel Patterson sentenced Ronald to death by lethal injection plus 147 years. Ronald refused all rights to appeal. He would then go on to make this statement: "I, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr., want it to be known that it is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. It is further respectfully requested that this sentence be carried out expeditiously." He next went on trial for the murders of his 14 family members and was found guilty on February 10, 1989, again being sentenced to death by lethal injection. He also refused to appeal his death sentence, stating, "To those who oppose the death penalty, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment." The trial court conducted a hearing concerning Ronald's competence to waive further proceedings and concluded that his decision was knowing and intelligent. Ronald became the subject of the United States Supreme Court case Whitmore versus Arkansas when another death row inmate, Jonas Whitmore, attempted unsuccessfully to force an appeal of Ronald's case. Reverend Louis Franz and Jonas Whitmore contended that Ronald using his right to refuse appeal in fact jeopardized the appellate rights of other death row inmates. But by a 7-2 vote, the Supreme Court justices threw out this appeal. However, the ongoing legal proceedings had prevented Ronald's execution from being carried out. Ronald was watching television and eating what he thought would be his last meal when the news of his stay of execution was announced. In an interesting turn of events, while on death row, Ronald had to be separated from other prisoners as his life was threatened constantly. This was because he refused to appeal his death sentence, and the other prisoners believed Ronald was damaging their chances of beating their own death sentences. On May 31, 1990, Governor Bill Clinton signed Ronald's second execution warrant for June 25, 1990. This was the quickest sentence to execution to death time in United States history, since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Ronald refused all visitors, including legal counsel and clergy. His last words were, "Justice delayed finally be done is justifiable homicide." No family members claimed the body, so Ronald was buried in a pauper's plot at Lincoln Memorial Lawn in Varner, Lincoln County. Do you think Ronald's execution was a suitable punishment for his crimes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more videos like this, please be sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more true crime videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.